Rain, hospital lights, a man running through corridors like a predator who's finally cornered his prey. Where is she? Where is my wife? But Grace isn't his wife anymore, and those aren't his babies. What happens when a millionaire narcissist discovers the woman he's hunted for 18 months is giving birth to another man's triplets? What happens when control meets freedom? When obsession meets justice? This is the true story of how one woman turned her most vulnerable moment into her greatest victory. How she trapped the man who trapped her. How she won by letting him think he was winning. 32 weeks pregnant, 3 babies, one final confrontation, and cameras recording everything. If you love stories where the underdog wins, where justice is served, and where women refuse to stay victims, you're in the right place. Show some love with a like, share this with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe for more stories of courage and survival. Now let me tell you about the night Declan Pierce lost everything. The rain hammered against the windshield like bullets as Declan Pierce gripped the steering wheel of his black Mercedes. His knuckles were white, his jaw clenched so tight his teeth ached. 18 months. 18 months of searching, of hiring private investigators, of sleepless nights staring at her photograph on his phone. I spent 18 months looking for her, he whispered to the empty car. 18 months of dead ends and false leads. His phone buzzed on the passenger seat. The text message glowed in the darkness. Found her, Mount Sinai Hospital, maternity wing, room 412. She's there now. Maternity wing. The words didn't make sense. They couldn't make sense. Gotcha, Declan said, a slow smile spreading across his face. He threw open the car door and ran into the torrential downpour, his $1,000 coat instantly soaked through. He didn't care. After 18 months, nothing else mattered. The automatic doors of Mount Sinai Hospital whooshed open. Declan burst through, water streaming from his clothes, his hair plastered to his forehead. His chest heaved as he approached the reception desk. Grace Morgan, he demanded, slamming his hands on the counter. Where is she? The night nurse looked up, startled. Sir, visiting hours are over. You'll need to come back tomorrow. I'm her husband, Declan roared. Tell me where my wife is. The nurse's eyes widened. Sir, she's not listed as married, Anesho, and I need you to calm down or I'll have to call security. Declan didn't wait. He shoved past the desk, following the illuminated signs overhead. His designer shoes squeaked on the polished floor as he ran. A security guard called after him, but Declan ignored the shouts behind him. Maternity, labor, and delivery. The words on the signs made his stomach churn with confusion. What was Grace doing in the maternity ward? He rounded a corner and stopped dead. Through a large observation window, he could see into a surgical suite. His breath caught in his throat. Grace. His Grace. She lay on an operating table surrounded by doctors in blue scrubs. The bright surgical lights illuminated everything with brutal clarity, and standing beside her, holding her hand, was a man Declan had never seen before. A man wearing scrubs, looking at Grace with such tenderness that Declan's vision blurred with rage. First baby's out, a doctor announced, holding up a tiny squirming infant. It's a girl. Declan's world stopped spinning. Second baby coming, another doctor called. It's a boy. No, this wasn't possible. Third baby, the surgeon said, lifting another newborn into view. Another girl, 3 healthy babies. The man beside Grace leaned down and kissed her forehead. They were both crying, their faces radiant with joy, with love. Something inside Declan shattered. He didn't remember moving. He didn't remember making the conscious decision, but suddenly he was exploding through the delivery room doors, his voice a raw howl of betrayal and fury. Grace! Everyone in the operating room turned. The medical team froze, instruments still in their hands. Grace's head rolled toward him, her eyes glazed with medication but focusing slowly on his face. Terror bloomed across her features. What did you do? Declan screamed, advancing toward the table. What did you do? How could... Security guards grabbed him from behind, their arms locking around his chest and pulling him backward. Declan thrashed against them, his voice cracking as he screamed, You whore! You ran away! And whose babies are those? Grace! Grace! The man in scrubs stepped between Declan and Grace, his face cold with controlled fury. Get him out of here. Now. Sir, you're violating a restraining order, one of the security guards grunted, dragging Declan toward the door. I have rights, Declan bellowed. She's my wife. Those should be my. The doors slammed shut, cutting off his words. Declan fought against the guards as they hauled him down the hallway, his mind refusing to process what he'd just seen. 3 babies, Grace with another man, his carefully constructed world crumbling into dust. Get him out of the building, a nurse ordered. Call the police. As the guards dragged him toward the exit, Declan's shock gave way to something darker, something that whispered he'd lost, that Grace had won. But Declan Pierce never lost. Not yet. The screen flickered to black. Then words appeared in stark white letters. 48 hours earlier, 18 months ago, Grace Reynolds had packed her life into 2 suitcases in the middle of the night. She'd taken her clothes, her grandmother's jewelry, and nothing else. Not the credit cards Declan had given her, not the designer handbags or the expensive perfumes. Nothing that tied her to him. She'd left a note on the marble kitchen counter. I'm done. Don't look for me. Then she'd walked out of the luxury Tribeca apartment and disappeared. Now, Grace Morgan, she'd taken back her maiden name, sat in her small office at the Hawthorne Medical Foundation, one hand resting on her swollen belly. At 32 weeks pregnant with triplets, even the simplest task left her breathless. But she loved her work coordinating the new neonatal intensive care unit program, pouring her experience as a former trauma nurse into helping the most vulnerable patients. How are you feeling? James Hawthorne asked from the doorway. Grace looked up and smiled. Even after 10 months together, seeing James still made her heart skip. At 41, he was distinguished rather than handsome, with silver threading through his dark hair and kind brown eyes that actually saw her. Not as a possession, not as something to control, just as Grace. Like I'm smuggling watermelons, she said. 3 of them. James crossed the room and set a cup of decaf coffee on her desk. He perched on the edge, his expensive suit jacket rustling. Security checked in this morning. No activity, no sightings. Grace's smile faded. He's not going to stop, James. I know him. 18 months of silence just means he's planning something. Then we plan better. James took her hand, his thumb tracing gentle circles on her palm. I have the best security team money can buy. Armed guards at our building, restraining orders filed in 3 states. He can't get near you. Promise me something, Grace said quietly. Promise me that if he finds us, you won't do anything stupid. Don't confront him, just call the police. I promise. Neither of them noticed the telephoto camera lens aimed at their window from the building across the street. Neither of them saw the shutter clicking, capturing this tender moment to be delivered to Declan Pierce within the hour. Grace's story with James had begun a year ago at a job fair. She'd been wearing a wig, dark brown instead of her natural blonde, and thick-framed glasses that changed the shape of her face. She'd answered to Grace Morgan, not Grace Reynolds, and kept her eyes down as she moved through the Hawthorne Foundation booths. We're looking for someone to coordinate community outreach, the hiring manager had said, someone who understands healthcare from the inside. Grace had been a trauma nurse before Declan, before he'd convinced her that her job was too stressful and that she should let him take care of her, before he'd slowly, methodically isolated her from everyone she'd ever known. She'd gotten the job. For 6 months, she'd kept her head down and worked hard. Then James Hawthorne had recognized her at a company gala. You, he'd said, stopping mid-conversation to stare at her across the ballroom. You're Grace Reynolds. You were my wife's nurse. Grace's blood had turned to ice. Elizabeth Hawthorne had died 3 years ago from complications following surgery. Grace had been there, holding Elizabeth's hand through those final, painful nights, giving her dignity when the pain grew too much to bear. Please, Grace had whispered, please don't tell anyone. James had studied her, really looked at her, and seen the fear in her eyes. I would never, he'd said softly. You gave Elizabeth peace in her last days. You gave her dignity. I could never repay that kindness. He'd kept her secret, and slowly, over late nights, working on foundation projects, Grace had told him about Declan, about the gaslighting, the control, the way Declan had isolated her from friends and family until he was her entire world, the forced medical procedure that had left her believing she could never have children. You're safe now, James had said. I promise you're safe. Grace had wanted to believe him. Now, as her delivery date approached, Grace filed for divorce. It was the final legal step to freedom. Her lawyer had explained that according to the prenuptial agreement Declan had insisted she sign, if Grace remarried and had children within 3 years of filing for divorce, she could transfer her 40% ownership shares in Pierce Properties to a family trust. Those shares are worth about $160 million, the lawyer had said. Your husband will fight this with everything he has. I know, Grace had replied, but I'm not afraid anymore. That had been 2 weeks ago, 2 weeks that felt like borrowed time. Across town in his corner office overlooking Central Park, Declan Pierce stood at his wall of evidence. Photographs covered the surface. Grainy surveillance photos of Grace entering the Hawthorne Foundation building, sitting at outdoor cafes, walking through Central Park. He'd tracked her movements for weeks once his private investigator had finally located her, but the newest photo was different. In it, Grace walked beside James Hawthorne, and her coat was unbuttoned, revealing an unmistakable baby bump. Declan's hand trembled as he held the photograph. When was this taken? He asked quietly. His executive assistant, Vanessa Pierce, no relation, despite sharing a last name, checked her tablet. Yesterday afternoon, Mr. Pierce, I think maybe you should consider that she's moved on. Maybe you should. She hasn't moved on, Declan interrupted, his voice soft and dangerous. She's confused. She needs help. Vanessa nodded slowly. She'd worked for Declan for 5 years, and she'd seen how devastated he'd been when Grace left. Poor Declan, abandoned by the woman he loved. Of course he wanted to help her. That's what Vanessa told herself anyway. Of course, Vanessa said. I'm sorry. What do you need me to do? Find out everything about James Hawthorne, every business dealing, every scandal, every weakness. Declan placed the photograph down carefully, his finger tracing Grace's face, and find out when that baby is due. His lawyer had already he explained the stakes. If Grace had a child with another man, if she remarried, she could activate the clause in their prenuptial agreement. She could transfer her 40% ownership in Pierce Properties to a trust, effectively giving her and her new family controlling interest in his company. Everything Declan had built would belong to Grace and whoever's child she carried. That couldn't happen. His father, Richard Pierce, had already made that clear during their last phone call. If you lose this company because you couldn't keep your wife satisfied, you are no son of mine, Richard had said coldly. Fix this, Declan, or you're cut off permanently. Declan stared at the photograph of pregnant Grace smiling up at James Hawthorne, and something dark and calculating settled over his features. I'll fix it, he promised the empty room. I'll fix everything. The Plaza Hotel glittered like something from a fairy tale. 800 guests in designer gowns and tuxedos filled the grand ballroom for the annual Hawthorne Foundation Gala. Manhattan's elite gathered to celebrate medical innovation and write checks large enough to fund entire hospital wings. Grace stood in front of the full-length mirror in the ladies' lounge, smoothing down her navy maternity gown. At 30 weeks pregnant, she felt enormous and ungainly, but James insisted she looked radiant. You're stunning, he said now, adjusting the diamond necklace at her throat. It had belonged to his mother, and he'd given it to Grace last month when she'd finally agreed to marry him. And safe, security screened everyone. Metal detectors at every entrance. Declan's photo has been distributed to every guard. Grace took a deep breath. This was her first major public appearance with James. The foundation's donors would meet her officially. The press would photograph them together. There would be no more hiding. I can do this, she said, more to herself than to James. You can do this, he echoed, taking her hand. They entered the ballroom together. The first 45 minutes were easier than Grace expected. Donors were kind, asking about her pregnancy with genuine interest. Several women shared their own stories of difficult pregnancies and the miracles of modern medicine. Grace found herself relaxing, even laughing. Maybe this would be okay. Maybe she really had escaped. Then the lights dimmed for the evening's presentations. We have a special surprise, the evening's host announced from the stage. A video message from one of our founding donors. The massive screens flanking the stage flickered to life, and Declan's face appeared. Grace's breath stopped in her lungs. Her fingers dug into James's arm. Good evening, Declan said from the screen, his smile warm and charming. I'm Declan Pierce of Pierce Properties. I'm thrilled to support the Hawthorne Foundation's incredible work in healthcare innovation. James immediately signaled security, but it was too late. 800 people were watching. 800 phones were already recording. I'm especially moved by their support for women's mental health initiatives, Declan continued, his expression shifting to concern. Because mental health struggles can affect anyone, even people we love deeply. No, Grace whispered. No. My former wife, Grace Reynolds, struggled deeply after a difficult medical procedure several years ago, Declan said, his voice heavy with fake sympathy. She required psychiatric care and extensive support during a very dark time in her life. He held up documents to the camera, official-looking papers with medical letterhead. I want everyone here tonight to know how proud I am that Grace is getting the help she needs, even if she felt she had to run away from her treatment to do it. Declan's eyes seemed to look directly at Grace through the screen. Grace, if you're watching, please come home. Let me help you. You don't need to hide from the people who love you. The video ended. Silence filled the ballroom. Then a wave of whispers crashed over Grace like a tsunami. Is that her? She needed psychiatric care. She ran away from treatment. Oh my God, she's pregnant. Is that safe? Grace stood frozen in the center of the ballroom. 800 faces turning toward her with expressions ranging from pity to concern to fascination at the unfolding drama. A society matron approached with exaggerated sympathy. Oh, honey, are you okay? Do you need to sit down? Should someone call your doctor? The woman spoke slowly, carefully, as if Grace were fragile, broken. I'm fine, Grace managed. Those documents are out of context. Of course, the woman interrupted, patting Grace's arm. It's so brave of you to be here. You're so strong. But her eyes said, you're unstable. You're a liability. More people were pulling out their phones now, recording, posting to social media. A board member was pulling James aside, speaking in low, urgent tones. Grace caught fragments. Foundation's reputation, documented mental health crisis, the optics are terrible. Grace felt the room spinning. She'd spent 18 months building a new life, a new reputation, a new identity, and Declan had destroyed it all in 3 minutes. She turned and fled toward the bathroom, James calling her name behind her. Grace barely made it into the marble bathroom before her legs gave out. She collapsed against the sink, gasping for air, her reflection in the mirror showing a woman whose carefully constructed armor had just shattered. James burst through the door seconds later. Grace, he destroyed me, she said, her voice breaking, in front of everyone. They all think I'm crazy now. They think I'm a liability to you and your foundation. I don't care what they think. Your board cares, Grace shouted. I heard them. I just ruined everything you've built. The foundation's reputation, your credibility, everything. A sharp pain lanced through her abdomen. Grace gasped, clutching her stomach. Grace? James's voice went sharp with fear. What's wrong? Contractions, Grace panted. The stress. My doctor said stress could trigger early labor. Another contraction hit, stronger this time. Grace looked down and saw spots of blood on her gown. James already had his phone out. I need an ambulance at the Plaza Hotel now. Pregnant woman, 32 weeks, carrying triplets. Premature labor. Grace stared at her reflection, humiliated, terrified, her body failing her. In the mirror, she could see everything Declan wanted her to see. A broken woman who couldn't escape him no matter how far she ran. He wins, she whispered. He always wins. James wrapped his arms around her as another contraction made her cry out. No, he said fiercely. No, he doesn't win. Not this time. But Grace couldn't believe him. Not when her body was betraying her. Not when her world was crumbling around her for the second time in 18 months. The ambulance arrived 12 minutes later. As paramedics loaded Grace onto a stretcher, she could hear the buzz of conversation from the ballroom. 800 people discussing her mental health, her stability, her fitness to be a mother. Declan had won the first battle. Grace just didn't know yet that the war was far from over. Presbyterian Hospital's private maternity ward was quiet at 3 in the morning. Grace lay in a hospital bed, hooked up to monitors tracking her vital signs and the baby's heartbeats. The medication had stopped the contractions. The bleeding had slowed. The triplets were stable. But Grace couldn't sleep. She kept seeing Declan's face on that screen, kept hearing the whispers, kept feeling the weight of 800 pitying stares. James sat in the chair beside her bed, laptop open, working through the night. He'd barely left her side since the ambulance arrived. "My lawyers filed harassment charges 2 hours ago," he said quietly. "The video violated your restraining order. The judge has issued a contempt citation." Grace's head turned slowly. "What does that mean?" "It means Declan will be arrested," James's lawyer's voice crackled over the speakerphone, "within the next 24 hours. This was a direct violation of the restraining order. He'll face a minimum 48-hour hold, possibly jail time." For the first time since the gala, Grace felt something other than despair. "Arrested, really?" "Really," the lawyer confirmed. "This was a massive mistake on his part. Harassment in front of 800 witnesses, using falsified medical documents, violating a restraining order. Any judge will throw the book at him." James squeezed Grace's hand. "You hear that? He's going to jail. It's over." Grace wanted to believe it. God, she wanted to believe it so badly. "It's really over," she whispered. "It's really over." James promised. They held each other in the quiet hospital room, and for the first time in 18 months, Grace let herself hope. The next 48 hours felt like a dream. Grace watched the news coverage of Declan's arrest on the courthouse steps, cameras flashing as he was led away in handcuffs, his expensive suit rumpled, his face a mask of rage. The headline read, "Real estate heir arrested for stalking pregnant ex-wife." Her doctors declared the baby stable enough for Grace to move around. She walked the hallways with James, made plans for the nursery on his tablet, even laughed at his terrible jokes about needing to learn how to change 3 diapers at once. Vanessa Pierce sent a public statement through her lawyers, resigning from her position at Pierce Properties and apologizing for her role in facilitating Mr. Pierce's inappropriate behavior. Grace felt a complicated mix of satisfaction and pity reading those words. On the 3rd morning, James brought fresh flowers and Grace's favorite pastries from the bakery near their apartment. "The judge set bail at $500,000, he said, settling into his usual chair. "His lawyers are scrambling. His father refused to pay it. He's going to stay in jail until the trial." Grace bit into a croissant, savoring the buttery flakiness. "How long until trial?" "Months, probably. Plenty of time for the babies to be born safely, for us to get married, for you to activate that trust clause and secure your shares." James grinned. "He tried to destroy you, and instead he destroyed himself." Grace smiled back. For the first time since leaving Declan 18 months ago, she felt truly free. Then James's phone rang. His face went carefully blank as he listened. "I see. When? I understand. Thank you for calling." He hung up slowly. "What's wrong?" Grace asked, the croissant turning to ash in her mouth. "Declan posted bail," James said quietly. "His father changed his mind, posted $500,000 an hour ago, and his legal team got the contempt charge reduced to a fine." The room felt airless. "He's out?" Grace whispered. "He's out, but the restraining order is still in effect. If he comes near you, it's immediate arrest. He can't—" "He's out there right now," Grace interrupted, "planning his next move. You said he'd be in jail. You said—" "I know, I'm sorry, but he can't hurt you. Not legally. The system will—" Grace laughed, but it was a broken sound. "The system? James, the system just let him buy his way out. The system doesn't protect women like me. It protects men like him." She turned to stare out the window. Somewhere in Manhattan, Declan Pierce was free. Planning, scheming, coming for her. Grace didn't see Declan's Mercedes parked across the street from the hospital. Didn't see him sitting in the driver's seat, staring up at her window with cold calculation in his eyes. But she felt him, like a predator circling its prey. The false victory of his arrest crumbled into dust, and Grace realized with horrible clarity that this wasn't over. It had barely begun. Dr. Sarah Mitchell had been Grace's obstetrician for 6 months. She was 48 years old, Competent, warm, and exactly the kind of Dr. Grace needed. Someone who listened, who took her concerns seriously, who never made her feel paranoid when she asked about extra security precautions. "How are we feeling today?" Dr. Mitchell asked, entering Grace's hospital room with her usual professional smile. Grace was sitting up in bed, color finally returning to her face after 3 days of bed rest. The baby's heartbeats were strong and steady on the monitor. "Scared," Grace admitted, "but the babies are okay?" Dr. Mitchell reviewed the monitors, nodding. "All three heartbeats strong, but your blood pressure is elevated. Stress-related?" "My ex-husband got out on bail," Grace said quietly. "He's somewhere in the city right now, planning something. I know him. He won't stop until—" She trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. Dr. Mitchell's face was sympathetic. "I heard about the gala incident. I'm so sorry you're going through this." She prepared a syringe and injected medication into Grace's IV line. "This will help you rest. You need calm for the babies." "Thank you," Grace said, already feeling drowsy. "You've been wonderful through all of this, Dr. Mitchell." The doctor smiled, but if Grace had been more alert, she might have noticed something off in that smile. Something guilty. 10 minutes later, Dr. Mitchell stood in a quiet stairwell, her phone pressed to her ear. "Yes, I've documented everything," she said quietly. "Elevated anxiety, resistance to standard protocols, paranoid ideation about her ex-husband attempting to interfere with her care." "Good." Declan's voice was smooth through the phone. "Keep building the case. I need medical evidence that she's unstable, evidence that will hold up in court." Dr. Mitchell closed her eyes. "Mr. Pierce, I need to know, when will the donation happen?" "My daughter's surgery is scheduled in 3 weeks. The kidney transplant costs—" "You'll get your kidney," Declan interrupted. "Same blood type as your daughter, verified by my personal physician. And the $1 million for the surgery and post-operative care. But you need to keep doing exactly what we agreed." "I'm a doctor," Dr. Mitchell whispered, tears in her voice. "This goes against everything I swore to uphold. I'm falsifying medical records. I'm betraying a patient's trust." "Your daughter will die without that kidney," Declan said coldly. "Emma is 17 years old, her whole life ahead of her. Do you want to save her, or do you want to maintain your precious ethics while you bury your only child?" The silence stretched between them. "I'll send you the updated notes, Dr. Mitchell finally said, her voice hollow. She hung up and leaned against the concrete wall, crying silently. She thought of Emma at home, hooked up to dialysis, her body slowly failing. Emma, who wanted to go to college next year, who wanted to become a veterinarian, who had so much life left to live, if only. Dr. Mitchell wiped her tears and pulled out her tablet to begin falsifying Grace's medical records. Grace couldn't sleep that night, despite the medication. Something felt wrong, though she couldn't articulate what. A sense of unease had settled over her like a heavy blanket. At 2 in the morning, she carefully disconnected her IV and walked to the nurse's station to get water. The ward was quiet, most patients sleeping. As Grace passed a small office near the nurse's station, she heard Dr. Mitchell's voice. Grace stopped walking. "I can't keep doing this," Dr. Mitchell was saying, her voice strained. "She trusts me. I'm altering medical notes to make her sound unstable when she's perfectly lucid. She's a model patient, smart, compliant, reasonable, and I'm painting her as paranoid and non-compliant." Grace's blood turned to ice. "I know I agreed to this," Dr. Mitchell continued after a pause. "Yes, I know about Emma. I know my daughter needs that transplant. But this woman has done nothing wrong, and I'm—" Another pause. "Fine, I'll document that she refused medication today, even though she took every dose without complaint." Grace backed away from the door, her hand over her mouth to stifle any sound. Her mind raced. Dr. Mitchell was working for Declan. Her own doctor, the woman she trusted with her baby's lives, had been bought. Every private conversation Grace had shared, every fear she'd confessed, every vulnerable moment, all reported back to Declan. Grace made it back to her room before her knees gave out. She sat on the edge of the bed, shaking, trying to think through the medication fog in her brain. If Dr. Mitchell had been falsifying records, that meant Grace's medical file was full of lies. Documentation of instability, paranoia, non-compliance, all fabricated. All ammunition Declan could use against her in court. She picked up her phone and called James. Grace? His voice was groggy with sleep. It's 2 in the morning. Are you okay? Dr. Mitchell is working for Declan, Grace said, forcing her voice to stay calm. I heard her on the phone. She's been changing my medical records, making me sound unstable. She's documenting things that never happened. A long pause. Are you sure? James asked carefully. The medication they gave you can sometimes cause... I'm not imagining this. Grace's voice rose. Then she caught herself. Getting emotional would only make her sound exactly how Dr. Mitchell was portraying her. James, I heard her. She mentioned her daughter needing a kidney transplant. Declan must be offering to pay for it or donate himself in exchange for her cooperation. Another pause, but this time James's voice was steady. Okay, I believe you. What do you want to do? Grace thought fast. If we confront her, she'll deny everything. We need proof, and we need... She stopped, an idea forming. We need to make Declan think he's winning. What are you planning? Something he'll never expect, Grace said. Me fighting back. The next morning, Grace acted as if nothing had changed. She smiled at Dr. Mitchell during rounds, took her medication obediently, asked appropriate questions about fetal development. But when Dr. Mitchell left, Grace was already texting James, we need to meet with your security team and a lawyer who specializes in medical fraud today. By evening, Grace had a plan. It was risky. It was dangerous. It might not work. But for the first time since Declan had destroyed her at the gala, Grace felt like herself again. Not a victim, not prey, a woman with agency, a woman with a plan, a woman who was done running. The courtroom was smaller than Grace expected and colder. She sat beside James and her attorney, her hands folded over her pregnant belly, trying to look calm and rational and stable, trying to look like someone who deserved to make decisions about her own body. Declan sat across the aisle with his legal team, 3 lawyers in expensive suits, all carrying thick folders of documentation. He wore a navy suit that made him look respectable, concerned, like a man genuinely worried about his mentally unstable ex-wife. Grace had received the emergency hearing notice only 2 hours ago. 2 hours to prepare for the fight of her life. Your Honor, Declan's lead attorney began, standing with practiced ease. We're requesting emergency medical guardianship over Ms. Reynolds' pregnancy. She has a documented history of mental health crisis following a previous pregnancy termination, and her current treating physician has expressed serious concerns about her decision-making capacity. Grace's attorney shot to his feet. Your Honor, this is outrageous. We weren't given proper notice. This is an emergency hearing, Counselor, Judge Martha Henderson said dryly. She was in her 60s, with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense expression. Continue, Mr. Brennan. Declan's lawyer presented a thick stack of papers. We have medical documentation from Dr. Sarah Mitchell, Ms. Reynolds' obstetrician at Presbyterian Hospital. Dr. Mitchell states that Ms. Reynolds has been non-compliant with prenatal care, has missed multiple appointments, refuses medication, and exhibits paranoid ideation. Judge Henderson took the papers, reading carefully. Grace's hands clenched into fists under the table. These notes indicate she refused prenatal vitamins, the judge said, that she accused her doctor of conspiring with her ex-husband, that she became agitated when asked to follow standard medical protocols. Your Honor, those notes are falsified, Grace said, unable to stay silent. Dr. Mitchell has been paid by Mr. Pierce to Ms. Reynolds. Do you have proof of these allegations? I overheard a phone conversation. So you have no documentation, no recording, no witnesses? Grace's mouth opened and closed. No, Your Honor, but this is exactly the paranoid behavior Dr. Mitchell documented, Declan's lawyer interjected smoothly. My client is genuinely concerned that Ms. Reynolds' mental health crisis may endanger not only herself but her unborn children. Judge Henderson looked at Declan. Mr. Pierce, what is your relationship to Ms. Reynolds? Declan stood, and Grace saw him transform. His face became gentle, concerned, every inch the worried ex-husband who still cared despite being abandoned. We were married for 5 years, Your Honor, he said quietly. I love her. I just want her to get help before something terrible happens to her or these babies. The performance was perfect. Grace felt sick watching it. Your Honor, James spoke up for the first time. I'm James Hawthorne. Ms. Reynolds and I are engaged. I've been with her throughout this pregnancy, and I can assure you she has been nothing but responsible and compliant with all medical care. Mr. Hawthorne, the judge interrupted, are you a medical professional? No, Your Honor, but then your observations, while well-meaning, don't carry the same weight as Dr. Mitchell's professional medical opinion. Judge Henderson flipped through more pages. I'm troubled by these notes. Very troubled. Grace felt her world tilting. However, the judge continued, I'm also troubled by the timing of this hearing and the lack of proper notice. I'm not prepared to grant full guardianship today. Grace's lungs expanded with hope. But, Judge Henderson continued, and that single word crushed the air from Grace's chest, I am going to order a 72-hour psychiatric evaluation to be conducted at the hospital where Ms. Reynolds is currently receiving care. Given her advanced pregnancy, she should not be moved to a psychiatric facility. Your Honor, a psychiatric evaluation at this stage of pregnancy could, Grace's lawyer began, and I am granting temporary medical guardianship to Mr. Pierce pending the results of that evaluation. The courtroom seemed to tilt. No, Grace whispered. No, you can't. This means Mr. Pierce will have authority over medical decisions regarding the pregnancy until the psychiatric evaluation is complete and reviewed. At that time, we will reconvene, and I will make a final determination about permanent guardianship status. Declan's face was solemn, appropriately concerned, but when he looked at Grace, his eyes held triumph. He'd won. Your Honor, please. Grace tried to stand, but James caught her arm. We'll appeal, James said quietly. We'll fight this. But they both knew appeals took time, and Grace didn't have time. She was 32 weeks pregnant with triplets. Any day now, she might need an emergency C-section, medical interventions, decisions about her baby's lives. And Declan would be the one making those decisions. In the hospital hallway afterward, Grace sat in a wheelchair, hospital policy even though she could walk, while James paced in front of her like a caged animal. He has control, Grace said numbly. If something goes wrong during delivery, if I need an emergency procedure, if the babies need medical intervention, he decides. My lawyers are already filing the appeal. Appeals take weeks, months. I don't have months. Grace's voice broke. James, don't you understand? He could order the doctors to induce labor early. He could claim it's medically necessary for my mental health. And with Dr. Mitchell backing him up, no one would question it. He could endanger my babies to punish me. James knelt in front of the wheelchair, taking her hands. Then we get proof. We record Dr. Mitchell. We catch her admitting what she's done. And if we can't, if she's too careful, Grace looked at him, her eye burning with unshed tears. I need you to promise me something. Anything. If he tries to make a medical decision that endangers our babies, if he orders something that could hurt them, she took a shaking breath. You do whatever you have to do to protect them, even if it means breaking the law, even if it means losing everything. Grace, promise me. James's jaw clenched. I promise, but it won't come to that. We're going to stop him. Grace wanted to believe that, but as hospital staff wheeled her back to her room, she felt the weight of Declan's control settling over her like a cage. For 18 months, she'd been free. She'd made her own choices, lived her own life, dreamed of a future where she controlled her own destiny. And in one courtroom hearing, Declan had taken it all away. That night, alone in her hospital room while James went home to shower and change clothes, Grace stared at the ceiling and made a decision. She was done being a victim. It was time to set a trap so perfect, so irresistible, that Declan would destroy himself. Marcus Reed was the kind of private investigator who made criminals nervous and lawyers confident. At 55, he'd spent 30 years in law enforcement before going private, specializing in cases of domestic abuse, stalking, and harassment. He sat across from Grace and James in Grace's hospital room, a digital recorder on the bedside table between them. You understand what you are proposing, Marcus said, his voice gravelly from too many years of smoking. You want to bait him. Make him violate the restraining order in a way we can document completely. Yes, Grace said. He has temporary guardianship, James added, which means if he shows up at the hospital claiming he's here for Grace's medical care, security has to let him in. Marcus nodded slowly. But if he threatens her, if he shows violent intent, if he proves he's a danger, then the guardianship becomes null and you have grounds for permanent protection. Exactly, Grace said. She pulled out a hospital floor plan she had drawn. We need to leak information through Vanessa Pierce. She's still in contact with Declan, despite her public resignation. We tell her I'm being transferred to Mount Sinai Hospital tomorrow for specialized care because the babies are showing signs of distress. But they're not in distress, James said. The babies are fine. Declan doesn't know that. We also leaked that paternity tests will be run when the babies are born. Grace looked at Declan's business card, which Marcus had obtained through his investigation. We hint that if the babies aren't his, if he has no biological claim, he loses the guardianship immediately. And he loses any claim to my inheritance shares in Pierce Properties. Marcus leaned back, considering. He'll come. He'll storm the hospital, Grace corrected. He won't be able to stop himself. Declan's fatal flaw has always been his pride. He can't resist gloating when he thinks he's won, and he'll think the paternity test is his last chance to maintain control. So we have cameras everywhere, James said. Audio recording, security positioned but not visible. Police on standby. We let him violate the restraining order, let him threaten Grace, let him prove conclusively that he's dangerous. Marcus studied Grace carefully. You'll be in active labor when this happens, or at least you'll appear to be. You'll be at your most vulnerable. I've been vulnerable for 18 months, Grace said, her voice hard. I'm done being prey. This time, I'm the hunter. If anything goes wrong, James started. Nothing will go wrong, Grace interrupted, because Declan needs me alive to get those shares. He won't actually hurt me physically, but he will threaten me. He'll reveal who he really is in front of witnesses, on camera, with no way to claim it was a misunderstanding. Marcus exchanged a long look with James. This is risky as hell. So is living under Declan's guardianship for the next month, Grace replied. So is giving him the power to make medical decisions that could kill my babies. I'd rather take the risk now, on my terms, than wait for him to make his move on his. After a long moment, Marcus nodded. Okay, let's set the trap. Over the next 24 hours, they built an elaborate web. Marcus installed tiny cameras in what would be Grace's new hospital room at Mount Sinai. High definition, recording both video and audio, completely hidden in smoke detectors and wall outlets. Hospital security at Mount Sinai was briefed by Detective Lisa Williams, a sharp-eyed 42-year-old who specialized in domestic violence cases. Her team would be positioned throughout the maternity ward, dressed as orderlies and nurses, weapons concealed, but accessible. Grace's actual obstetrician, Dr. Jessica Miller, who replaced Dr. Mitchell after the truth about Sarah Mitchell's conflict of interest came to light, agreed to be present for the transfer, despite it being a sham. She would verify that Grace's labor was real or induced by stress, not faked, and then they activated the leak. A hospital administrator, actually one of Marcus's associates, called Vanessa Pierce's personal number. Ms. Pierce, I know you worked for Declan Pierce until recently. I thought you should know that Grace Reynolds is being transferred to Mount Sinai Hospital tomorrow evening. There have been complications with the pregnancy. Complications? Vanessa's voice was sharp with concern. She might have resigned, but she still cared about Declan, still believed he was the victim. The babies are showing signs of distress. They may need to induce labor early and, the administrator paused delicately. There's been discussion of running paternity tests once the babies are born, to establish legal parentage for the guardianship case. Paternity tests, Vanessa repeated. When? The transfer happens tomorrow at 8 p.m. After that, it's up to the doctors when delivery occurs. Vanessa hung up. 15 minutes later, Declan's phone rang. Grace didn't know exactly what Declan did when he got that call. But Marcus had someone watching Declan's apartment, and the report came back within an hour. Subject went to his home office immediately after the call. Lights stayed on for 3 hours. At 11 p.m., subject left his apartment carrying a briefcase. Appeared agitated, drove around Manhattan for 90 minutes. Returned home at 12:30 a.m., Lights stayed on until 3 a.m. He's planning, Grace said quietly, reading the report, trying to figure out his play. He'll come to the hospital, James said. The question is how. He'll storm in, Grace predicted. He'll claim guardianship rights, demand to see me, and when he gets into that room, she took a breath. He'll show everyone exactly who he is. The next evening, as Grace was loaded into an ambulance for the transfer to Mount Sinai, she felt strangely calm. For 18 months, she'd been reacting to Declan's moves, running from his investigators, hiding from his reach. This time she was in control. This time she was ready. But as the ambulance pulled away from Presbyterian Hospital, something unexpected happened. Grace gasped, her hand flying to her stomach. "James," she said, "something's wrong." The paramedic monitoring her vitals leaned closer. "What is it?" "Contractions. Real ones." Grace gripped the ambulance handrail. "Strong ones." The paramedic checked the fetal monitor. "Her blood pressure is spiking. All three babies' heart rates are showing irregularities." "This wasn't supposed to happen yet," James said, panic creeping into his voice. "The stress from setting this trap." Grace panted through another contraction. "My body can't tell the difference between real danger and manufactured danger. It thinks," she gasped, "it thinks I'm in crisis." The paramedic spoke into his radio. "Mount Sinai, this is Unit 7. We have a patient in preterm labor, 32 weeks with triplets, showing signs of fetal distress. We need an OR ready immediately." Grace met James's eyes, and she saw her own fear reflected there. The trap was about to spring, but she was genuinely in labor, genuinely in medical crisis, and Declan was coming. "It's going to be okay," James said, but his voice shook. Grace didn't answer. She was too busy trying to breathe through contractions that were coming faster and harder. The plan had been to fake distress, to appear vulnerable while maintaining control, but now the vulnerability was real, and Declan was already on his way. Mount Sinai Hospital's maternity wing was controlled chaos. Nurses rushed to prepare an operating room for emergency cesarean section. Dr. Jessica Miller was already scrubbed in, reviewing Grace's medical history with her surgical team. "Triplets at 32 weeks, Dr. Miller said crisply. "All three are showing signs of distress. We need to deliver now." Grace was wheeled into the operating room on a gurney, James beside her in surgical scrubs. The anesthesiologist was preparing an epidural. "This is really happening," Grace said, her voice foggy with fear and adrenaline. "James, this is really happening." "You're going to be fine," he said, squeezing her hand. "The babies are going to be fine." Detective Williams appeared in the doorway, her expression urgent. "Declan Pierce just entered the building. We have eyes on him." Grace's head turned, fighting through the haze of pain. "Already? How did he—" "Someone must have tipped him off to the actual transfer time," Marcus Reed said, appearing behind Williams. "He's heading for the maternity wing now. We have officers in position." Dr. Miller looked at Grace. "We need to put you under for the C-section. The babies can't wait." "No," Grace said, "not yet. I need to—" Another contraction tore through her and she screamed. "Now, Grace," Dr. Miller said firmly. "We deliver now or we risk losing them." Grace looked at James, her eyes wild. Promise me you won't let him—" "I promise," James said. "I love you." "I love you too." The anesthesiologist administered the epidural. Grace's eyes began to flutter closed as medication flowed through the IV, and that's when they heard it. Declan's voice echoing down the hallway outside. "Where is she? Where is my wife?" Declan Pierce had spent 18 months searching for Grace. He'd spent a fortune on private investigators. He'd manipulated courts and doctors and anyone else who could give him access to her. And now, running down the sterile hallway of Mount Sinai Hospital, rain-soaked and desperate, he felt everything slipping through his fingers. Paternity tests. The words rang in his head like funeral bells. If those babies weren't his, and they couldn't be his, he'd done the math, worked out the timeline. Then he had no biological claim, no guardianship, no leverage for the Pierce property shares. He would lose everything. His father had already made that clear in their last conversation. If Grace activates that trust clause, If she transfers 40% of the companies to her children with another man, you're finished, Richard Pierce had said coldly. The board will vote with her. You'll be removed as CEO, and I will not fight for you. You did this to yourself. Declan couldn't let that happen. Security guards moved to intercept him, but Declan waved the guardianship papers in the air. I have court-ordered medical guardianship. I have a right to make medical decisions for her. You have to let me see her. The guards hesitated, radioing for confirmation. That hesitation was all Declan needed. He shoved past them, following signs toward labor and delivery, his expensive shoes squeaking on the linoleum. He rounded a corner and saw it. Operating Room 4. Grace's name on the chart by the door. Through the small window, he could see everything. Grace on the operating table, her face peaceful with anesthesia. Doctors working quickly, making the first incision for cesarean section. James Hawthorne standing at Grace's head, holding her hand, wearing surgical scrubs like he belonged there. And then, first baby's out, a doctor announced, holding up a tiny squirming infant covered in vernix. It's a girl. Declan's world stopped. He watched, frozen, as the doctor handed the baby to a nurse, watched as they suctioned the tiny nose and mouth, watched as the baby's cry filled the operating room, thin and reedy, but alive. Second baby, another doctor said. It's a boy. Another cry, another life entering the world. Third baby, the surgeon announced. Another girl. 3 babies. 3 perfect, healthy babies that should have been his. Should have been his future, his legacy, his path to keeping everything he'd built. But they weren't. They belonged to Grace and James Hawthorne. They represented Grace's victory, her escape, her new life, a life that didn't include him. Something inside Declan shattered. He wasn't conscious of making the decision. One moment he was standing at the window, and the next he was exploding through the operating room doors, his voice a raw howl of rage and betrayal. Grace, what is this? Whose babies are those? The surgical team froze. Instruments clattered. Someone gasped. James Hawthorne stepped between Declan and the operating table, his face cold with controlled fury. Get out, now! But Declan couldn't hear him, couldn't hear anything over the roaring in his ears. 3 babies? Declan shouted, staring at the newborns being cleaned and assessed by nurses. 3? When did this happen? How long have you been? Security guards rushed in, grabbing his arms. I have rights, Declan bellowed, fighting against their grip. I'm her legal guardian. You can't keep me from... Mr. Pierce, Detective Williams said, appearing in the doorway with 2 uniformed officers. You're violating a restraining order. I have guardianship. Declan waved the papers, now crumpled in his fist. The court gave me... That guardianship was obtained through fraudulent medical evidence, Williams said calmly. She held up a USB drive. We have Dr. Sarah Mitchell's full confession. Recorded, signed, notarized. Every falsified note, every lie, every payment you made to her. Declan's face went white. No, that's not... We also have recordings from tonight. You storming into an operating room, threatening a woman in active labor, endangering medical personnel and newborn infants. Williams nodded to her officers. Declan Pierce, you're under arrest. You can't do this, Declan thrashed against the guards holding him. Those babies should be mine. She was mine. I built everything for her and she... Grace's eyes fluttered open at the sound of his voice. Still groggy from medication, she turned her head and saw him. Their eyes met across the operating room, and Grace smiled. It was a small smile. Tired. Victorious. Checkmate, she whispered. Declan's face contorted with rage. As the officers dragged him toward the door, he unleashed a torrent of threats. You think you've won? I'll destroy you. I'll make sure everyone knows what you are. You're nothing. You're mine. You'll always be mine. I'll get the best lawyers. I'll appeal every ruling. I'll fight this until... The doors slammed shut, cutting off his words. The operating room fell silent except for the soft cries of 3 newborn babies. Dr. Miller looked at Grace, who was crying now, from relief, from exhaustion, from the overwhelming rush of bringing 3 lives into the world while facing down her abuser one final time. Grace, Dr. Miller said gently, holding one of the babies, Your daughter, Elizabeth." She placed the tiny infant in Grace's arms. Grace looked down at the scrunched-up face, the impossibly small fingers, and felt something break open in her chest. "Hi, sweet girl," she whispered. "You're safe now. We're all safe now." Enid James was crying too, holding the other two babies, Emma and Jackson, three perfect, healthy children, three miracles. "It's over," James said, his voice thick with emotion. "It's really over." And this time Grace believed him. In the hallway outside, Detective Williams cuffed Declan while reading him his rights. Stalking, harassment, multiple violations of a restraining order, fraud, conspiracy to commit medical malpractice, endangering the welfare of minors. Williams recited the charges like a litany. Declan had stopped fighting. He stood silent, handcuffed, rain still dripping from his expensive clothes. "Do you understand these rights as I've explained them to you?" Williams asked. Declan didn't answer. He was staring at the closed operating room door, at the life on the other side that had moved on without him. "Mr. Pierce, she was supposed to need me," Declan said quietly. "I took care of everything. I made sure she didn't have to worry about money or decisions or anything. She was supposed to realize that and come back." Williams had seen this before, abusers who genuinely couldn't understand that control wasn't love. "She never needed you," Williams said. "She needed freedom. There's a difference." She led Declan away while Marcus Reed ensured every camera, every audio recording, every piece of evidence was secured and backed up in multiple locations. The trap had worked, but it had cost Grace more than she'd planned. The stress had triggered real labor. She'd been genuinely vulnerable. And for those terrible minutes when Declan burst into the operating room, anything could have happened. But Grace had survived. She'd done more than survive. She'd won. The trial of Declan Pierce began 8 weeks after that night at Mount Sinai Hospital. The Manhattan courthouse was packed with journalists, victims' advocates, and other women who had come forward after Grace's story went public. 7 women. 7 other women whom Declan had isolated, controlled, and gaslit until they felt like they were losing their minds. Grace sat in the witness box on the trial's 3rd day, wearing a simple navy suit, her blonde hair pulled back. She'd lost most of the pregnancy weight, though dark circles under her eyes testified to nights spent caring for 3 infants. But her voice was steady as she testified. "He didn't hit me," Grace said, looking directly at the jury. "He didn't have to. He made me believe I was worthless, that I was crazy, that no one would believe me if I tried to leave." The prosecutor, a sharp woman named Amanda Anderson, asked, "Did you believe that?" "For a long time, yes. He was so good at it, so subtle. He'd question my memory of conversations. He'd tell me I was too sensitive when I got upset about something he did. He'd isolate me from friends and family by saying they were toxic or didn't understand our relationship." Grace took a breath. "By the time I left, I genuinely wasn't sure if I was losing my mind or if he was making me feel that way." "What made you finally leave?" Grace's hands tightened on the edge of the witness box. "I got pregnant, and he—" Her voice wavered, then steadied. "He forced me to have an abortion. Said we weren't ready, said I wasn't stable enough. The procedure went wrong and left scar tissue that doctors said would prevent future pregnancies." In the gallery, someone gasped. "That's when I realized, if I stayed, he would kill everything inside me. Maybe not my body, but my spirit. My sense of self, everything that made me who I was would die." Grace looked at Declan for the first time. He sat at the defense table, impeccably dressed, his face a mask of wounded dignity. "So I ran." Amanda Anderson approached the witness box. "Ms. Morgan, after you left, Mr. Pierce hired multiple private investigators to find you. He used his wealth and connections to track you across state lines. He manipulated a doctor into falsifying your medical records. He violated a restraining order multiple times. He forced his way into an operating room while you were giving birth. In your opinion, why did he do all this?" Declan's defense attorney shot to his feet. "Objection, Your Honor, calls for speculation." "Your Honor, Ms. Morgan lived with the defendant for 5 years," Amanda countered. "She's uniquely qualified to speak to his motivations." Judge Henderson considered. "I'll allow it. Answer the question, Ms. Morgan." Grace looked at the jury. He did it because I left, she said simply. In Declan's mind, I was his possession, his property. When I left, it wasn't about love or wanting me back. It was about winning, about not letting anyone see that he'd lost control. She paused, choosing her words carefully. Declan doesn't love people. He collects them. And when something in his collection tries to escape, he'll do anything. Break any law, hurt anyone, pay any price to get it back. Not because he values it, but because losing it means he failed. The courtroom was silent. But he did fail, Grace said quietly. And maybe if he'd spent these 18 months accepting that failure and moving on, we wouldn't be here. But accepting failure isn't something Declan knows how to do. Amanda Anderson smiled. No further questions. Over the next 2 weeks, the prosecution presented its case. Dr. Sarah Mitchell testified tearfully about the payments Declan had made and the medical records she'd falsified. She'd already surrendered her medical license and pleaded guilty to medical fraud in exchange for immunity from criminal prosecution. My daughter needed a kidney transplant, Dr. Mitchell said, her voice breaking. Mr. Pierce was a perfect match and offered to donate in exchange for my cooperation. But when Grace Morgan found out what I'd done, she offered to be tested herself. She was also a match. She donated her kidney to my daughter and paid for the entire surgery, even though I'd betrayed her. Grace sat in the gallery, listening. Baby Emma, named partly for Elizabeth Hawthorne and partly for Emma Mitchell, slept in her arms. Vanessa Pierce testified about Declan's obsessive behavior, the wall of photographs in his office, the plans to induce Grace's labor early. I thought I was helping someone in love, Vanessa said, crying. But when he said he didn't care if the baby survived the early induction, that's when I realized I wasn't helping a man in love. I was helping someone dangerous. Security footage from the gala showed Declan's video playing on the massive screens, 800 people watching Grace's reputation destroyed. Audio recordings from the hospital captured Declan's threats in the operating room. And perhaps most damning, testimony from 6 other women who'd been in relationships with Declan before Grace. Each told similar stories of isolation, control, and psychological manipulation. I thought I was the only one woman testified. I thought there was something wrong with me. Finding out there were others, it was horrifying, but also validating. The defense tried to argue that Declan was simply a man trying to help his mentally ill ex-wife, that his actions, while perhaps overzealous, came from genuine concern. But the evidence was overwhelming. After 3 weeks of testimony, the jury deliberated for less than 6 hours. On the charge of stalking in the first degree, how do you find? Guilty, Your Honor. On the charge of harassment in the first degree? Guilty. On the charge of violating a restraining order? Guilty. On the charge of conspiracy to commit medical fraud? Guilty. On the charge of endangering the welfare of minors? Guilty. The verdicts continued. 18 charges in total. Guilty on every count. Declan sat motionless as the verdicts were read. His father, Richard Pierce, had refused to attend the trial. None of Declan's former friends sat in the gallery supporting him. He was alone. Judge Henderson set the sentencing hearing for 2 weeks later. On sentencing day, Grace returned to the courthouse. She'd submitted a victim impact statement, but chose not to read it in person. Instead, she sat in the gallery with James, holding his hand, and watched as justice was served. Declan Pierce, Judge Henderson said, her voice hard, you used your wealth, your connections, and your intelligence to terrorize a woman who had every right to leave you. You manipulated medical professionals, violated court orders, and endangered innocent children, all because you couldn't accept that someone chose freedom over you. She paused, letting the words sink in. This court sentences you to 15 years in state prison, followed by 10 years of probation. You will have no contact with Grace Morgan or her children for the rest of your natural life. You will undergo mandatory psychological treatment, and you will pay restitution in the amount of $5 million to be distributed among your victims. Declan's face remained blank. No emotion, no reaction. Furthermore, Judge Henderson continued, your ownership stake in Pierce Properties is hereby transferred to Ms. Morgan as part of the divorce settlement finalized yesterday. Do you understand this sentence? Yes, Your Honor, Declan said. His voice was hollow. As bailiffs led him away, Declan looked back one time. His eyes found Grace in the gallery. She stared back, unafraid. He was led through a door and disappeared from her life forever. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed. Grace gave a brief statement. This case was never about revenge. It was about safety. For me, for my children, and for every woman who's been told they're crazy when they're actually being abused. If my story helps even one person recognize the signs of psychological abuse and find the courage to leave, then everything I went through was worth it. She declined to answer questions, getting into the car where James waited with the triplets. As they drove away from the courthouse, Grace looked back one last time at the building where Declan would spend the next 15 years. She felt no triumph, no joy in his suffering, just relief, and the quiet knowledge that she was finally, truly free. 3 months after Declan's sentencing, Grace stood in the main hall of the Grace Morgan Foundation for Domestic Violence Survivors. The converted brownstone in Brooklyn had been purchased with settlement money from the divorce, 40% of Pierce Properties' value, which totaled $160 million. She'd kept $10 million for herself and the children. The rest had gone into the foundation. We have 16 beds, Grace explained to the reporter from the New York Times who was writing a profile piece. Women can stay here for up to 6 months while they get back on their feet. We provide legal services, mental health counseling, job training, and childcare. The reporter scribbled notes. And you've helped how many women in 3 months? 42 women and 61 children, Grace said. The numbers were seared into her heart. Each one represented a life saved, a future reclaimed. We get letters and calls every day from women who need help leaving abusive situations. Do you ever worry about your own safety? Declan Pierce won't be eligible for parole for at least 10 years, but there's always the possibility. I have excellent security, Grace said, gesturing to the 2 discreet guards who accompanied her everywhere. And honestly, I'm not afraid of him anymore. The woman he terrorized doesn't exist anymore. I'm not his victim. I'm not his wife. I'm not his property. I'm just Grace. And that's enough. That evening, Grace returned to the penthouse apartment she shared with James and the triplets. At 13 months old, Elizabeth, Emma, and Jackson were walking, or in Jackson's way, running everywhere with his sisters trying to keep up. How was your day? James asked, looking up from where he was building a tower of blocks with Elizabeth. Good, busy. We had 3 new intakes today. Grace sank onto the couch, exhaustion pulling at her bones. One woman had been trapped in her marriage for 15 years. 15 years, James. Her children are teenagers. She waited until they were old enough to understand before she left. James moved to sit beside her, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. You gave her that option. That's what the foundation does. It gives women options they didn't have before. Grace leaned into him, watching their children play. Emma toddles over, reaching her arms up, and Grace lifted her into her lap. Hi, sweet girl, Grace murmured, kissing Emma's soft hair. Did you have a good day with Daddy? Emma babbled something incomprehensible but enthusiastic. That's wonderful, Grace said, as if it made perfect sense. James's phone buzzed. He glanced at it, then showed Grace the screen, a news alert about Declan. Declan Pierce denied early appeal in stalking case. Grace read the headline and felt nothing. No satisfaction, no fear, just a distant acknowledgement that justice was continuing to run its course. Should we talk about it? James asked. No, Grace said. I don't think about him anymore, I really don't. And she meant it. For 18 months after leaving Declan, she'd lived in fear. Looked over her shoulder, jumped at unexpected sounds. Even during the trial, part of her had still been trapped in the mindset of a victim, reacting to Declan's moves, defending herself against his attacks. But now she woke up every morning and chose who she wanted to be. She ran a foundation that helped other women escape situations like hers. She raised 3 beautiful children with a man who treated her as an equal partner. She testified before Congress about the need for stronger protective order enforcement. She spoke at universities about recognizing the signs of psychological abuse. She lived. 6 months later, on a sunny afternoon in Central Park, Grace and James spread a picnic blanket, while the triplets toddled around on unsteady legs. Elizabeth, always the leader, walked confidently toward a group of ducks. Emma followed more cautiously. Jackson sat in the grass, examining a leaf with intense concentration. "Elizabeth, not too close to the water," Grace called. A young woman approached, hesitant. She was maybe 25, with nervous eyes and fingers that twisted together anxiously. "Excuse me," the woman said. "Are you Grace Morgan?" Grace smiled. "I am. I saw your testimony. From the trial, The woman's voice cracked. "I left my boyfriend last week. Because of you. Because I heard you say that not hitting someone doesn't mean they're not abusing you." Grace stood, her heart expanding. "You did that, not me. You saved yourself." "It's so hard," the woman whispered. "He keeps calling, texting, saying I'm overreacting, that he loves me, that I'm throwing away something good." "Can I ask you something?" Grace said gently. "When you were with him, did you feel free? Did you feel like yourself? Or did you feel like you were constantly walking on eggshells, trying not to upset him?" The woman's eyes filled with tears. "Eggshells, always eggshells." "That's not love," Grace said. "Love doesn't make you small. It doesn't make you afraid. Real love," she looked at James, who was helping Jackson stand up. "Real love makes you more yourself, not less." The woman wiped her eyes. "Does it get easier?" Grace was honest. "Some days are hard. I still have nightmares sometimes. But every day I wake up free. And that's worth fighting for." The woman nodded, squared her shoulders. "Thank you." As she walked away, Grace felt James's hand on her shoulder. "You're amazing," he said. "I'm surviving," Grace replied. "Some days that's enough." She gathered Emma, who had toddled over to investigate a pigeon. James corralled Elizabeth and Jackson. They packed up the picnic supplies. A happy, ordinary family doing ordinary things. As they walked through the park toward home, Grace noticed the two security guards trailing at a discreet distance. She'd probably have them for the rest of her life, or at least until Declan was an old man who'd served his sentence. But she wasn't afraid, because the truth was, Declan had already served his real sentence. He had lost everything that mattered to him: his reputation, his company, his freedom, his father's respect, while Grace had gained everything that truly mattered: her children, her safety, her sense of self, and the knowledge that she'd turned her pain into purpose. That night, after the triplets were asleep and James was working in his study, Grace stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of their apartment, looking out over Manhattan. Somewhere in this city, the Tribeca apartment where she'd once lived with Declan still stood. It had been sold during the divorce proceedings. Someone else lived there now. Someone who probably didn't know that those pristine marble counters had once held a note that said, "I'm done." Grace had been done, but she wasn't anymore. Now she was just beginning. Behind her, James emerged from his study and wrapped his arms around her waist. "What are you thinking about?" "Everything," Grace said, "and nothing. I was thinking about how far I've come, how different everything is." "Any regrets?" Grace considered the question seriously. "I regret the years I lost with Declan. I regret not leaving sooner. But I don't regret leaving. I don't regret fighting back. And I definitely don't regret where I ended up." She turned in his arms, looking up at him. "I love you, not because you saved me, I saved myself, but because you let me save myself. You didn't try to fix me or rescue me. You just stood beside me while I figured out how to be whole again." James kissed her forehead. "That's the easy part. You did all the hard work." In the nursery down the hall, one of the babies started to cry. Jackson, based on the pitch. Grace and James moved together to comfort him, partners in this messy, beautiful, ordinary life they'd built. And as Grace rocked her son back to sleep, humming softly in the darkness, she thought about all the women who would come to the foundation tomorrow. All the women who were sleeping in the shelter tonight, taking their first steps toward freedom. She thought about the letters she received, hundreds of them, from women who said her story had given them courage. She thought about Declan, alone in a prison cell, finally facing consequences for his actions. And she thought about herself, no longer a victim, no longer running, no longer afraid, just Grace. And that was enough. 1 year later, the Grace Morgan Foundation's annual gala was nothing like the Plaza Hotel disaster that had nearly destroyed Grace's life 2 years ago. This event, held in a Brooklyn warehouse converted into an elegant event space, featured speeches from survivors, performances from local artists, and quiet conversations between women who understood what it meant to reclaim your life. Grace stood at the microphone looking out over 200 donors and supporters. "When I left my abuser 18 months ago," she said, her voice steady, "I thought my life was over. I thought I'd always be looking over my shoulder. I thought I'd never feel safe again." She paused, letting her gaze sweep across the room. "I was wrong. Not because the fear disappeared overnight. It didn't. Not because healing was easy. It wasn't. But because I learned something crucial. I am not defined by what was done to me. I'm defined by what I do next." In the audience, 7 women, Declan's other victims, sat together. They'd formed their own support group, meeting monthly to process their experiences and support each other's healing. This foundation has helped 412 women and 673 children in its first year, Grace continued. Each one of those women made the hardest choice of her life: to leave, to fight, to believe she deserved better. She looked at James sitting in the front row with the triplets, now 2 years old, on his lap. "I'm not going to stand here and tell you that leaving an abuser is easy. It's not. I'm not going to tell you that you'll immediately be fine. You won't. But I am going to tell you this. You deserve to be safe. You deserve to be free. You deserve to live without fear." Grace smiled. "And if you need help making that happen, we're here." The room erupted in applause. Later that night, after the gala ended and the children were asleep and James was snoring softly beside her, Grace's phone buzzed with a text message. It was from Dr. Sarah Mitchell. The message read, "Thank you for giving Emma her life back and for giving me a chance to make amends. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I'm grateful for it anyway." Grace typed back, "We all make mistakes when we're desperate. What matters is what we do after. Keep doing better." She set the phone down and closed her eyes. Tomorrow she would wake up and do it all again. Run the foundation, care for her children, testify at another legislative hearing about domestic violence protections. The work was endless, but it mattered, because Grace had learned something important. Survival wasn't enough. Thriving was the goal, and she was finally, truly thriving. 5 years later, Declan Pierce came up for his first parole hearing. Grace received a notification from the Victim Services Office asking if she wanted to submit a statement or attend. She declined both. Declan was denied parole. He would serve the full 15 years. Grace didn't celebrate. She didn't cry. She didn't feel anything except a distant sense of closure. Because Declan Pierce was no longer the main character in her story. She was. And her story was just beginning.